Hello, good evening, and welcome to our ECHA talk this evening with Dr. Francis Young. Many of you will know of Dr. Francis Young's work. He's classicist, Cambridge educated, historian, author of about 24 books, I believe. Very well known historian, has written on Catholic history, and in fact, I think gave our first talk on Zoom during lockdown some while ago. So very welcome, Dr. Francis Young.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Excellent. So hopefully you can all see the first slide there, even if it's hidden by some of our faces. My subject this evening is English Catholics and the supernatural, and I was quite pleased to be asked to speak on this subject because it was in fact the subject of my very first book. So as Tim mentioned, I have written quite a few books since then, but this was the first, and it came out 11 years ago in 2013, and it was also the subject of my PhD research. So this is a bit of a blast from the past to be revisiting this subject. Now, I think it's fairly well known how others during the Reformation period thought about Catholics in relation to belief in the supernatural. It's fairly well known that Protestant polemic tended to be directed against Catholics as superstitious, as credulous, and as fakers of supernatural phenomena. And in fact, I would make a distinction between these three different discourses when it comes to outside views, if you like, Protestant views of Catholic belief in the supernatural in this period. So the idea that Catholics were credulous and superstitious, and I've got an image there of a pilgrim badge which portrays the famous Rood of Grace of Boxley. Now, the Rood of Grace of Boxley, in case you're unaware of what it was an automaton. It was a crucifix, a figure of our Lord on the cross, and it could be activated in various ways so that the body moved, and it was a center of pilgrimage, very, very popular. But of course, this was, to the reformers, absolutely awful. You know, this was an example of fraud, deception of the faithful, the worst kind of Catholic trickery. And so the Rood of Boxley becomes the focus in the early Reformation period. In fact, as early as the Henrician Reformation in the 1530s, it becomes the focus of two of these discourses. And one of them is the idea that Catholics are credulous and superstitious. So in other words, anybody who believed that the Rood of Grace was in any way valuable, needed to re-educate themselves and realize that it wasn't, but also that Catholics were fakers of the supernatural. Now, you might think that those two views are in tension with one another, because how can you simultaneously be credulous and also a faker of the supernatural? And I think we have to bear in mind at this point the Protestant idea that Catholics were subject to priestcraft. So priestcraft being the idea that priests, monks, religious were manipulating the faithful into believing what they wanted them to believe. So the idea that there were clergy who were exploiting the faithful. So that's very much linked to that idea. And then there's a third discourse, which is partly linked to the idea of Catholics as credulous and superstitious. And this is first advanced in England by the polemicist John Bale. John Bale was writing in the 1530s. He was originally a Carmelite friar, in fact, but he became a very, very fiery Protestant preacher, and he was convinced that Catholicism actually equated to witchcraft itself. And so that's sort of the most extreme form of Protestant polemic against Catholicism. But my interest really is not in those external views that people had of what Catholics believed about the supernatural. There is a whole academic literature on anti-Catholicism and these kind of portrayals of Catholics and misrepresentations of Catholic belief. it's certainly true that Catholics found themselves at the center of this storm of polemic and rhetoric. But my question, which I began my PhD research with, was what did Catholics themselves actually think of supernatural phenomena? Now, before I go any further, a bit of an explanation of what I mean by supernatural. Those of you who know anything about theology will know that the word supernatural, strictly speaking, refers to the divine. It refers to God. It refers to the angels. It refers to the things of heaven. And the word I should be using is the word preternatural, because preternatural refers to other supernatural phenomena, other, if you like, spiritual phenomena that are not of God. The reason I used the word supernatural and not preternatural was simply because that word has drifted so far in popular understanding from its original theological meaning that I thought I kind of needed to use it. But what I'm really talking about here is preternatural phenomena. But I'll carry on using the word supernatural on the proviso that you understand I'm talking here about preternatural phenomena. In other words, things that are not necessarily of God, but they are of a kind of spiritual realm of existence. So my interest was what English Catholics thought about these four things. And they were miracles, ghosts, witchcraft and magic, and possession and exorcism. And having said that, I'm not talking about the supernatural in its strict sense. Of course, miracles would actually fall within the realm of the supernatural in its strict sense. These are all things that are debated at length in the Reformation by both Catholics and Protestants. And so in this talk, I'm going to say a little bit about what early modern English Catholics in the 16th, 17th centuries actually thought about these things and what I was able to recover of that. But I wanted to begin by explaining how this all started. How did I become interested in this subject? Now, I spent years working in Cambridge University Library on the history of two families, the Gage family of Hengrave Hall and the Rookwood family of Coldham Hall, who eventually merged into one family in the 19th century. And I spent a long time on these manuscripts. And one day I came across this very, very strange mezzotint. And those of you who know your M.R. James will already know that this is an ominous sign to come across a strange mezzotint. But it is in fact a mezzotint, and it's contained within these manuscripts. And it's this, you can see it on the screen. It's a portrayal of the Great Hall, the banqueting hall at Coldham Hall in Suffolk. And in that banqueting hall, there's various bits of armor and portraits, but specifically there are two portraits at the end of the hall depicting nuns or religious. They are in fact Augustinian canonesses, strictly speaking, not nuns. And this portrays an incident that supposedly took place in 1807. In 1807, a servant was carrying a drink for the master of the house up some stairs. And as he passed through the Great Hall, he saw these two figures, these two ladies, who had effectively emerged from these paintings and were now walking towards him across the hall. And so, of course, he was terrified. He dropped the glass that he was carrying, and this is the story that he told his master. Now, at the time, a great deal of fun was had with the story, and everybody said, well, you know, he was clearly trying to explain himself and get out of an accident that he'd caused through his own carelessness or drunkenness, and this is obviously nonsense. But the Rookwoods were interested enough in what had happened to commission this engraving, sorry, mezzotint. And it's a very unusual one because it portrays ghosts. It's very unusual to find a picture of this era from the early 19th century that portrays what somebody said they'd seen in terms of a ghost sighting. But it's even more unusual to find one that was created by Catholics. So they're a Catholic family who were interested in a report of a ghost sighting. And I was intrigued by this. I was so intrigued that I thought, this is actually a really interesting subject for a PhD, you know, to actually see what can I find from elsewhere in England that is similar to this, of Catholics actually reporting their own supernatural experiences or explaining their own supernatural beliefs. And so that's how it all began. Now, I don't want to characterize what Catholics believed as all uniform and all one thing, and it really wasn't. Because among Catholics in this period, you found varying degrees of skepticism, with some very open to supernatural phenomena and others less so. You also find change over time. By the 18th century, for example, it's becoming less fashionable to avow belief in the supernatural, even for Catholics, although Catholics are among the last people to abandon the idea of belief in the supernatural because of the commitments that they had to their faith. But nevertheless, it is true to say that Catholics consistently found themselves at odds with Calvinists. Calvinists who believed that the age of miracles had passed. And this is the view that is known in theology as cessationism. So the idea that miracles ceased at the death of the last apostle, and that there has been no need for miracles since that point. Therefore, any miracles that are reported are ipso facto false, probably created by the devil or fraudulent Catholic monks and priests, or faked by people, or the result of superstition and credulity. And that was a very widely held view amongst English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. Calvinism was the dominant theology of the Church of England up until the period when Archbishop Laud starts to introduce slightly different ideas in the 1630s. But the influence of Calvinism is very great indeed. And clearly, Catholics are going to find themselves very much at odds with that, given that they are committed by their faith to say that it is possible for God to perform miracles and saints to perform miracles by the power of God right up to the present day. At the same time, however, Catholics were usually at pains to distance themselves from the sort of religious enthusiasm of Anabaptists and Quakers, who were often coming from a rather apocalyptic point of view and saying the world is about to end soon, therefore we can expect to see signs and wonders. God is doing these strange things. The devil has been released into the world is about to end soon. Catholics tended not to buy into those kind of apocalyptic ideas. And so Catholics found themselves somewhere in between the Anabaptists and the Quakers on the one hand, and the Church of England with its rather rigid Calvinist view, cessationist view, on the other. But let's turn to our first subject, which is the subject of ghosts. Now, ghosts were ostensibly a point of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in the early Reformation period. And there were some Protestant controversialists who tried to portray ghosts as an artifact of Catholic superstition rooted in belief in purgatory. Now, we might not immediately think of purgatory when we think of ghosts, but people in the 16th century did. And the reason was that the 16th century ghost tends to be quite functional. Ghosts return for a purpose. They don't return just to scare people for no reason. They always return in order to right some injustice, in order to correct some omission that they made during their lifetime, in order to warn somebody of something that they should be doing, and so on. And in the late Middle Ages, it was established popular belief that this is a special favor of God, that God will allow the souls in purgatory under exceptional circumstances to visit the living in order to resolve some of these, kind of unresolved issues. And so ghosts were very much associated with purgatory. And a determined effort was made by these Protestant controversialists to stamp out belief in ghosts, but it failed. I would say this is one of the major failures of the English Reformation, a total failure, in fact. So whereas other aspects of the Reformation were very thoroughgoing and were able to stamp out Catholic belief, this one just did not work. And in fact, the Protestant controversialists eventually gave up because people just carried on believing in ghosts. And in fact, to this day, England is very strongly associated with its popular belief in ghosts, and it has some of the richest ghost lore of any country in Europe. Now, in terms of what Catholics thought, Catholics obviously carried on believing in ghosts because that belief in purgatory continues. But at the same time, Catholics also developed some of their own distinctive beliefs. Now, one of those, a good example, is the belief in spectral heads. And this is a particular tradition that we find in Lancashire, in County Durham, in North Yorkshire, where there's various reports of Catholic families who saw the disembodied head of someone who was usually a relative or someone closely connected with the family, perhaps who had been a chaplain, almost always a priest, close to the moment of that person's death, in most cases martyrdom. And this becomes linked to the idea of screaming skulls. I don't know whether anybody's encountered this idea, but it's the belief that there are skulls in certain old houses, that if you remove the skull, it will be bad luck for the family. And in many cases, those skulls are associated with Catholic martyrs. And there's a story that the Screaming Skulls legend was actually created as cover for the preservation of relics, that actually these were relics of martyrs, but they couldn't be openly displayed unless this story was told as cover. Now, that may be true, but there's also this tradition of disembodied heads. There's a few stories of people's heads being seen shortly before their martyrdoms, which seems to be a kind of distinctive Catholic sort of tradition of apparitions. But the Reformation itself also produced distinctive forms of ghost belief. And the most important of those is the monastic ghost. So after the Reformation, you get lots of families moving into houses or taking over houses that are on the site of or made out of ruined monastic houses. And one of the great ironies of the English Reformation is that quite a few of those families are actually Catholics. So recusant families live in former monastic houses. Like, for example, you've got the Brown family at Battle Abbey, are probably one of the most famous examples of that. There are plenty of others as well living in these houses. And they do seem to have felt a sense of guilt, a need to somehow expiate the inherent sacrilege of living in a building that had been belonged to the church. In fact, there were some Anglican families that also felt guilt at sacrilege of living in these buildings. And that seems to have expressed itself in a belief that those buildings were haunted, although that developed and changed over time. But that's, you know, a sort of distinctive feature of England, and I think very, very emblematic of the way the Reformation laid waste to our heritage, that it's expressed in the form of these ghost stories that keep coming back, and you find, you know, this theme very much in 20th century ghost stories like those of M.R. James. But let's move on to witchcraft. Now, when it comes to witchcraft, this was an area where Catholics and Protestants were broadly in theological agreement. There's no real difference in what Catholics and Protestants think about witchcraft in the 16th century. They are not in favor of it. That's certainly true. But in practice, Protestants tended to accuse Catholics of being soft on witches because they were soft on superstition. And Catholics, in turn, accused Protestants of causing the upsurge of witchcraft by removing the protection of the church's sacramental grace and encouraging contempt for sacred places and things. So you've got these Catholic controversialists who'll say, well, you know, you've got this big problem with witchcraft in England. Is it any wonder you've taken down all your wayside crosses, you've removed all your statues of the saints from churches, you've removed the mass, you've removed the priesthood, people are without protection from the devil. Of course, there's going to be witchcraft. So both sides are kind of blaming the other for what's going on. And some Protestant controversialists tried to go a bit further. And as I mentioned, John Bale tries to pin the accusation of witchcraft on the church itself. And so, for example, he tries to portray the Mass as a kind of a necromantic ritual associated with witchcraft. And it could certainly have been the case that if people had taken John Bale seriously, we could have got to a point in England where Catholics were being persecuted for witchcraft or being accused of witchcraft just because they were Catholics. But that didn't happen. So it's a Rubicon that we didn't actually cross. There were no cases of people being put on trial for witchcraft because they were Catholics. In fact, there are no cases of people who are definitely Catholics being put on trial for witchcraft at all. In some ways, that's not surprising, given the fairly small proportion of the population in the 16th and 17th century who actually were Catholics outside of Lancashire, and the fact that they tended to be gentry and aristocracy. So it was harder to make accusations of witchcraft against the gentry and aristocracy. The only exception to this, or what comes close to being an exception to this, because I'm not sure whether it really counts as an exception, during the Pendle witch trials of 1612, where a group of women are arrested at Pendle in Lancashire, they're brought to Lancaster Castle and put on trial, accused of killing a child by witchcraft. There is a lady called Old Chattox. She's an old woman who is old enough to have remembered Queen Mary's time, certainly, and possibly the days of Henry VIII, so would have been brought up as a Catholic. Now, was she a Catholic? It's difficult to say. I mean, she certainly wasn't a conforming Protestant in the way that she was supposed to be, but I think it might be a bit much to say that she was a Catholic, in the sense that she was perhaps a residual Catholic, but not someone who would actively have identified as a recusant, not somebody who would have received the ministrations of missionary priests. There's no evidence that she did. But she was accused of talking to her cat in Latin and using these Latin prayers or charms, which she said she had learnt in Queen Mary's time. So that's the closest we come in any English witch trial to an association between Catholicism and witchcraft. But then just a year later, we have another witchcraft trial in Lancaster. This time the accused witches come from a place called Samlesbury, which is near Pendle. And the Samlesbury witches, it goes in a completely different direction. The course of the trial is totally different, because a girl makes accusations against these women. He accuses them of being witches. But when it turns out that she was prompted to do this by a missionary priest, by a Catholic priest, the judge basically tears into this Catholic priest, rips apart the evidence, and says, well, if this all comes from a Catholic priest, it must be completely worthless. He must be making this up for his own purposes. This is all Catholic fakery. Of course, they're not witches. And it seems that this particular way of interpreting witchcraft in relation to Catholicism ultimately triumphs. So it's not that Catholics get persecuted as witches. It's more that Catholics are suspected of accusing others of being witches because of their own superstitious assumptions or because of the trickery of their priests. And so it kind of goes in a completely different direction. Let's move on to exorcism now. Now, whereas Protestant and Catholic differences over ghosts and witchcraft are fairly slight, certainly after the Protestant controversialists abandoned the attempt to try and get rid of belief in ghosts, there isn't really that much difference in what Catholics and Protestants think. When it comes to exorcism, it does represent a substantial theological difference. However, Protestants themselves, I think it's important to say, were divided on the subject of exorcism. If you go back to the 1560s and 70s, the bishops of the Church of England themselves disagreed on whether exorcism was something which should be happening. And there were some bishops who were from a more sort of enthusiast tradition. Often they'd spent time in exile in places like Frankfurt. They had imbibed a particular kind of Protestantism, which was a bit more apocalyptic, a bit more open to the idea that the world was coming to its end and therefore the devil might be releasing his power, and Christians had to fight against the devil by means of exorcism. Now, the most prominent of those was actually not a bishop, but a martyrologist, John Foxe, who wrote the Acts and Monuments, which is a great book of Protestant martyrs. And he was quite an enthusiastic exorcist and did quite a lot of exorcisms. But there were others, particularly those who had spent time in exile in Zurich and Geneva, So they had, in other words, been under the influence of the Zwinglians and the influence of the Calvinists. They took a much more cessationist approach. So they said, well, in the same way that miracles ceased at the death of the last apostle, so it's probably the case that the devil ceased to be active in the world in the way that had been the case in the time of the apostles possessing people. Or if he was active in the world, then it would be forbidden for us as Christians to try and get rid of him, because to do so would be to attempt to perform a miracle, and miracles can't be performed after the death of the last apostle. And so you get Calvinists talking themselves into this slightly strange position where they're admitting, okay, yes, there are lots of people being possessed by the devil, but we can't really do anything about it because it would be going against God to try and fight the devil, as it were. Now, of course, to Catholics, this makes absolutely no sense at all, because they say, well, no, we've been given this ability, this sacramental, which allows the church to free people from demonic influence. So why don't we use it? And so when the Church of England eventually, after quite a degree of internal strife over the decades, eventually in 1604, it kind of comes down in practice, if not in theory, on that cessationist side of the debate, in that a canon is drawn up, Canon 72, which remained in force in the Church of England until 1969, by the way. Canon 72 makes it impossible to perform an exorcism unless a bishop specifically grants a license for the exorcism to take place. And between 1604 and 1969, no bishop ever granted a license for an exorcism to be performed. So, you know, in practice, it was impossible for exorcisms to take place in the Church of England. Now, of course, from the point of view of the Catholic Church, that's great, because that leaves Catholic priests as the only game in town, apart from those kind of rebellious Protestants who were going against what the Church of England taught. And of course, there were Puritans who were practicing a different form of exorcism by prayer and fasting. So it's almost a kind of exorcism by preaching, you know, yell at the demons until they depart, rather than the sacramental exorcism practiced by the Catholic Church. But it gave significant opportunities for missionary priests, not only to perform exorcisms, but also to publicize those exorcisms, although, of course, they had to be very careful to do so, because that might give away their location, it might allow them to be captured by the authorities, and to portray themselves as the ones who had true power from Christ's church to exorcise demons, which the Church of England did not. And so they said, well, the reason the Church of England is refusing to do this is because they know they haven't got really the power to do it. And what's interesting about these campaigns of exorcism, the most famous of which takes place between 1585 and 1586 and is carried out by the Jesuit William Weston, is that the appeal of exorcism seems to extend well beyond the scope of the Catholic mission. The Catholic mission, as I'm sure you all know, in that period is very patchy. You know, it's very, very difficult for priests to carry out, you know, basic functions like saying mass and hearing confessions, let alone performing exorcisms on people. And there are many areas of the country that they're not able to reach because there aren't, for example, recusant houses that were willing to shelter them and recusant families who were able to provide them with some sort of cover. And so, yeah, the mission is patchy. But the desire for exorcism by Catholic priests seems to be universal. So something which, you know, looking at the sources, you find throughout the country, people all over the country, whether they've ever met a Catholic priest or not, and most of them probably hadn't met a Catholic priest, you know, into the 17th, into the 18th century, people who had no clue about Catholicism other than the sort of anti-Catholic sentiments they would have heard in their local parish church, still wanted a Catholic priest when it came to exorcism, still had the belief that the only priest who could truly exorcise and truly had this power were Catholic priests. And there were instances where, you know, priests would do this for non-Catholics. You know, they would help them out because it was a way of bringing people to the Catholic faith. So it was this extraordinary mission opportunity and this kind of market that Catholic priests managed to corner, if you like. And it becomes a major source of controversy as well with the Protestants. And the most notable instance of this occurs in 1601. And in that year, a book appears by Samuel Harsnet. Samuel Harsnet later becomes the Archbishop of York. He's not yet the Archbishop of York at that point, but he's a senior cleric in the Church of England. And it's called A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures. And Harsnet effectively captured anyone he could find who had been involved with William Weston's mission in 1585, 1586, so a few years earlier, and interrogates them, in some cases tortures them, so that they describe in detail what William Weston was up to. And he then publishes this massive expose of Weston's exorcism, making fun of them and denouncing the idea of exorcism. Although one of the strange things about a declaration of egregious popish impostures is that its real target is actually not Catholics. The real target is actually a Puritan exorcist called John Darrell, who had been exorcising in Nottinghamshire and elsewhere, who claimed to be doing so in the name of the Church of England. Harsnet was absolutely determined that that should be stopped. And a few years later, it was, definitively stopped in 1604 with that Canon 72. So really, this book, although it's about Catholics, what it's really about in terms of what its real agenda is a kind of an internal dispute within the Church of England. So you have to sometimes bear this in mind with the anti-Catholic texts. Sometimes anti-Catholic texts aren't really about Catholicism. They're really about these kind of disputes within Anglicanism itself. Now, I just wanted to say a little bit as well about some of the aspects of Catholic involvement with supernatural belief, which I've looked at since I completed that book, English Catholics and the Supernatural. One of the frustrations when you do a PhD, when you then have a book based on it, is that inevitably there's going to be things you then come across later that you realize actually, either I didn't have time to incorporate this, or, I only found out later that this existed. And something which I only found out later existed. In 2012, I moved into, as my office, so where I actually worked, the old Bishop's Palace in Ely in Cambridgeshire. And this is the massive 15th century building that's next to Ely Cathedral, built originally by Bishop Alcock. And there was a 16th century long gallery that was added to this palace. And so as soon as I moved into this building and had my office in it, I thought, well, I'd better find out about the history of this. It's fascinating. And there didn't seem to be anything written on the history of it. And so I thought I'll write a book about the history of this palace. And what I found, which I was very interested in, was that it had been used as a prison for recusant gentlemen. Now, you may well have heard of Wisbech Castle, used as a prison for recusant for Catholic priests during Elizabeth's reign into James's reign. But there was a twin prison, if you like, which was used for Catholic laymen, and that was the Bishop's Palace in Ely, because it was standing empty at the time. And one of those laymen, the most prominent of them, was Sir Thomas Tresham, probably the most significant of all the lay Catholics of the late 16th century in the English Catholic community. And Thomas Tresham, in the British Library, there is this extraordinary archive of all his papers. All his papers were preserved after his death, hidden behind a wall at Rushton Hall, and later discovered in the 19th century. So we have the lot. Unfortunately, his handwriting is absolutely atrocious, so it's quite hard to read them. But if you suffer through trying to read the handwriting, you can find a very, very detailed description that he gave of decorations that he commissioned for this long gallery in Ely, because it was his prison. And as with his famous buildings, the Triangular Lodge at Rushton and the Banqueting Hall at Lyvedon in Northamptonshire, he included lots of secret symbolism in this decoration, because that was his form of resistance. It was to encode Catholicism under secret forms. And he was very into numerology, the idea of numbers with secret significances. And something which I realized when I was looking at this was that, in fact, he had made extensive use of the Christian Kabbalah. So that is to say, Christians, Renaissance writers who were inspired by the Jewish Kabbalah and created their own versions of it. And one of those was Pietro Galatino. And nobody had actually noticed or made much of a connection before between Thomas Tresham and the Kabbalah. Everybody thought he had his own sort of eccentric numerology. But it kind of makes sense because the Kabbalah was probably the most notable numerological system and best known in Europe at that time. And so that came out in an article in 2020, eventually in British Catholic History, which is called Thomas Tresham and the Christian Kabbalah, which kind of explains those connections and what he was doing in Ely. And something else which I wanted to mention, this resulted in another book, which was partly kind of inspired by things that I'd come across whilst researching English Catholics and the supernatural and hadn't been able to include. And this was a book called Magic as a Political Crime in Medieval and Early Modern England. It came out in 2017. Now, the subject of this book is not specifically Catholics. The subject is people who used magic or tried to use magic in order to kill or to overthrow monarchs at any point in English history, so medieval and early modern. It goes all the way back to the reign of Edward II. But it does happen to be the case that many of those who passionately objected to Elizabeth I, for example, in the 1560s and 1570s, were also Catholics, supporters of Mary Queen of Scots, for example. And some of them did resort to forms of magic in order to try and overthrow the Queen. Now, in some cases, those were false accusations. So in the 1560s, for example, there was a panic about popish conjurers in Essex, the belief that there were magicians who were effectively, people who had supported Queen Mary, who were lingering in recusant houses in Essex, who were working spells against the Queen. And this is one of the impetuses for the 1563 Witchcraft Act, which is the first Witchcraft Act that, well, there's an earlier one, but it doesn't last for very long. It's the first Witchcraft Act that's actually put into force in England and carries on in force until it's replaced by another act by James I in 1604. And that seems to have been a false accusation. There's no evidence that really was true. Another false accusation was made against Blessed John Story. Blessed John Story had fled the country after Elizabeth's accession, gone to the Spanish Netherlands, and becomes an inspector of ships. He'd previously, I think, been Chancellor of the Diocese of Canterbury under Reginald Pole. And John Story is kidnapped by English intelligence and taken back to England, put on trial for the things that he'd done in Queen Mary's reign, despite the fact that those things had actually been legal at the time. This is in 1571. And he is accused of a magical conspiracy against Elizabeth and of collaborating with somebody called John Prestall. Now, that accusation against Blessed John Story was not true, but the accusations against John Prestall were true, because John Prestall was he a Catholic? It's hard to tell. I'm not sure that sort of allegiance was even meaningful to him. He's a very mercurial character, quite literally, because he was an alchemist. And he's somebody who seems to have been a compulsive traitor, a sort of traitor for hire. People would essentially employ him, and he would come up with these madcap schemes involving alchemical technologies that would help them to achieve their aim. So, for example, he managed to persuade the Duke of Alva that he would find a way for the Spaniards to satellite the English fleet using a form of alchemical wildfire, probably something a bit like Greek fire, some sort of petroleum. But that never actually worked. He made similar promises to the supporters of Mary Queen of Scots. And he also made these bizarre alchemical promises to Elizabeth herself. And despite the fact that he conspired at least 4 times to kill Elizabeth, every single time she let him off. And the only reason she did that was that she herself was a very strong believer in alchemy. And she was, in fact, practiced alchemy herself from time to time. And she seems to have given alchemists the benefit of the doubt in a way that she didn't give anybody else that sort of leeway. And so Prestel just kept getting off, despite constantly being a traitor. But again, we don't know he was a Catholic. It's just that he did ally himself at various points with Catholic factions and with their aims. I think he was probably just a generalized con man in my view. But yeah, he was somebody who certainly was engaged in this sort of activity. So I suppose you could ask, what have I learned about the relationship between Catholics and supernatural belief in this period from all my research? And what I would say is that I don't think there's any evidence that Catholics were any more credulous about supernatural claims than Protestants were. I don't think there's any evidence that Catholics believed things that were significantly different from their neighbors. And one of the arguments that I make in the book, in English Catholics and the Supernatural, is that Catholics coexisted with their neighbors, who were usually Church of England Protestants, and shared a folk culture. So while they may have had different religious beliefs, in terms of their beliefs that form part of that wider folk culture, they were broadly the same. Now, of course, it might be the case that missionary priests were imbuing Catholics with ideas that were distinctively different. But when it came to something like ghosts, for example, I think it's clear that Catholics and Protestants believed broadly the same thing, because they belonged to this kind of coherent English folk culture in which ghosts and hauntings played quite a major role. But when it came to something like exorcism, then clearly that was a major difference. And I think more fundamental than that, the Catholic affirmation of the possibility of miracles and the possibility that exorcism could be effective was fundamental to Catholic belief. Not because miracles and exorcism mattered more than anything else. Those aren't the things that matter the most. But because that affirmation of the possibility of miracles was an affirmation of human free will and the possibility of the agency of God in the world. One of the great disputes between Catholics and Calvinists of the period was over the issue of free will, with Calvin saying that essentially there was no freedom of the will because the ultimate destiny of every human being was predetermined, predestined. And therefore God had made that decree at the beginning of the universe and nothing could change it. And therefore the means of grace that were put forward by the church were of no effectiveness whatsoever. So I think for Catholics to affirm that miracles were possible, even if they weren't necessarily very credulous about those miracles, and there were many Catholics who were quite skeptical about miracles, but they always accepted that basic principle that God could intervene and that it was possible for means of grace to effect a change in someone's life. And so I think in that sense, this is quite fundamental to the disputes of the Reformation and what Catholicism was offering people compared to its competitors. And I think that it also reflects the image of God that Catholics were preaching. Whereas the God of the Calvinists was to some extent constrained by these decrees that God had made at the beginning of the world, the God of the Catholics was able to intervene and could have been perceived or was presented in Catholic teaching as a more merciful God than the God of the Calvinists. So I think these things like exorcism clearly have a very important pastoral dimension, even though some of the practices that were employed at the time might give us pause today. So that's my conclusion. I'd be very happy to take any questions that people might have about this subject or anything related to it. But thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Francis, for your interesting talk. I've put something in the chat box, basically, for people to ask questions. Can you see the chat box, Francis?
Yes, I can.
I think we've got something in there from Sean Pilcher. I won't read it all out, it's quite long, but if you have a look at that and respond,
Yeah,
possible.
yeah, about relics.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, clearly relics are also the question is where, could I say something about the role of relics in these controversies? Relics obviously were a major area of controversy between Catholics and Protestants. Relics do, yeah, they crop up quite a lot in these discussions because, as I mentioned, the idea that some of these screaming skull stories might actually be linked to the preservation of relics, that either people were covering up the existence of those relics with those stories, or they'd sort of forgotten that they were relics, and therefore they had to come up with some kind of explanation for why there are these random bones and skulls hanging around the house. And the obvious thing to spring to mind would be, oh, it's something ghostly and uncanny. And I think also the role that relics play in exorcisms. I mean, the Jesuits in particular are very, very keen on relics of Saint Ignatius. And they have a belief that relics of Saint Ignatius, at least at that period, were almost as powerful as anything. So, if you could get hold of a relic of Saint Ignatius, that in itself might be enough just to do the exorcism by touching somebody's body with that relic, or St. Francis Xavier, likewise, very, very popular. So, yeah, relics in that sense kind of almost act as proxies for the act of exorcism itself, because they sort of they play a key role in that. But yeah, from a Protestant point of view, obviously relics are superstitious. They're a demonic deception. John Bale would associate them with necromancy. He would say, this is a conjuring of the dead, just like sorcerers do. So yeah, relics kind of intersect with these kind of discussions periodically.
Thanks very much. I wonder if maybe I could ask you about it later, but if there's a good source to read on the relics of Saint Ignatius, I might be curious. We just named our baby Ignatius, and so just a personal curiosity, it might be a fun anecdote to share down the road.
Yeah. I can't think of anything specifically about the relics, but there is a lot of interesting stuff that's coming out now on the Jesuits, and there's a Journal of Jesuit Studies now, which has some brilliant articles. And I mean, these stories themselves, obviously they're in my book, but you can also find them in Henry Foley's kind of multi-volume history of the English Jesuits, which is very, very detailed and goes into these sort of accounts.
Thanks very
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? Yes, we have a question from Francisco. I believe. Francis, can you see in the box? It
Yeah.
says, yes, when
Cunning
it comes
folk,
to
yes. Were they more likely to be identified as Catholic or Protestant, or does it vary? Yeah, cunning folk, these are the sort of service magicians, the professional magicians who offered people services like recovering stolen goods or uncovering the identity of a thief. And they are people who stand sort of outside the kind of the witchcraft idea because they're perceived as good. And their role in relation to Catholicism is that they almost step into the gap left behind by the Catholic clergy after the Reformation, because in the late Middle Ages, clergy had often taken on these roles and done a little bit of magic for their parishioners on the side. But obviously, once the Reformation has taken away most of the sacramentals, that sort of stuff has gone. And it's not possible for clergy to behave in that way because that's considered completely unacceptable in a Protestant context. And so the cunning folk, these lay people, sort of step in. Now, sometimes they do use Catholic words, Catholic charms. I mean, in Wales, for example, right up to the 19th century, you've got these wizards writing on pieces of paper garbled Catholic prayers for farmers to stick inside their barns to protect their cattle and things like that. But what I would say is that this is almost a kind of a substitute for a Catholicism that is no longer there, rather than a continuation of Catholicism, because I don't think there's not any indication that these cunning folk were actually Catholics in the sense of receiving the ministrations of the missionary priests, going to mass, actually attempting to practice Catholicism. It's more that these Latin prayers, these Catholic prayers, they retain this kind of residual power, this sacred power, and therefore, they become of magical significance. So it's not quite the same thing as Catholicism actually continuing.
I think that tradition of Latin prayers has continued up until the present day as well in fiction and popular culture and so forth as well, actually.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the fact that all the spells in Harry Potter are cod Latin. I mean, that the idea that Latin is a kind of a magical language, that's a legacy of the Reformation.
I think it is a sort of hocus pocus kind of vague memory of Latin chants or Latin phrases, etc., etc., and somehow they have some sort of magical properties. The language, the words actually themselves, but by saying these magical words, somehow it enacts some change or conjures a spirit or whatever it happens to be, which I suppose.
No, that's absolutely right. And what people wanted, they wanted Catholic priests, but if they couldn't get Catholic priests, then using those magical words was a substitute, and therefore the Cunning Folk kind of stood in place of the priests, if you like.
I thought the idea of the link between the heads and the relics was fascinating, actually, because many of these Catholic recusant families must have kept relics of favourite saints of various sorts, whether bits of saints or bits of clothing or whatever it happens to be. And that was very much part of Catholic belief, but must have seemed extremely strange to a lot of Calvinists, I'd imagine, and certainly very suspicious in sort of the 17th century.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got records of people storing like the bones of St. Chad were stored inside a hollow bedstead for about 200 years. So yes, if this sort of stuff was found lying around the house, you kind of had to have a story to explain why it was there, and sort of invoking ghosts was probably the best way to do it.
Yes. I suppose that may have stopped people asking questions if they just said it's the resident ghost or whatever, don't ask questions or something or other, and shut people up and try to divert attention away from what was actually going on, really. Let's see if we've got any more questions here. So, Sister
There's a
Wahlberger.
question here about purgatory.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, yes, it was the belief that sometimes somebody wouldn't be able to move on from purgatory to heaven until their ghost had been sent to earth to perform this function. And there was likewise a belief that God did this in part to relieve the suffering in purgatory, but also in order to give proofs of the existence of purgatory to the living. And that's why the Protestant controversialists got very, very het up about ghosts, because they thought, every time somebody reported a ghost, it was yet another kind of nail in the coffin of Henry VIII's declaration that purgatory didn't exist. And so it was a challenge to that idea. But yeah, it failed. They weren't able to stamp it out. But having said that, I think the association between ghosts and purgatory has sort of broken in popular culture. I don't think many people now, unless they were Catholic, would associate ghosts with purgatory, although they might still have this kind of residual idea that I saw the ghost of my dead loved one because they were trying to warn me of something, because they were trying to tell me something, because they were sometimes you get that idea of a ghost coming back for some sort of purpose. But I think the link with purgatory has mostly been broken.
I think there still is very much residual belief in ghosts of some sort or spirits among even people who aren't necessarily or describing themselves as religious or Christian or whatever.
Yeah. Oh yes, I think it's a
stamped out.
fundamental feature of English culture, so fundamental that it even has survived secularization. It survived the Reformation, and it's now surviving the secularization of our culture. So yeah, it's not going anywhere, I don't think.
I mean, so many people can tell you ghost stories or hear of ghost stories, or somebody's told them one or something or other, and it on a winter's evening round a fire, it is quite entertaining, really. even if it's not true, it's quite entertaining. Do we
Indeed,
have any
yeah.
more questions? I think
Yeah, I
Francis
need to
had
go,
too.
unfortunately.
Yes.
But it's been a great pleasure
Okay.
speaking to you all, and thank you very much for some great questions.
Brilliant. Yes. And do another talk for us at sometime in the future, hopefully.
I'd love to.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, thank you very much for an interesting and stimulating talk. I think it's very much appreciated by all the people who've attended. I think the 30 odd people who've attended this evening, and all those who will watch it on YouTube as well in due course as well, who'll be numerous, no doubt. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for everybody for participating and joining in our talk this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Right.